You have to ask tonight whether Boris Johnson is going to keep his job as Foreign Secretary for much longer. Last week, he said this.
You've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars.
Not very controversial, you might think, except that today the Prime Minister took the astonishing step of insisting the British Foreign Secretary was not speaking for Britain. Turf wars in Westminster do come and go, but tonight their spat is very public. Also on News at 10. In another startling intervention, Britain's top spy master goes public to lay into the Russians.
We cannot be safe from the threats that emanate from that land unless the civil war is brought to an end.
The Commons fall silent as an MP tells of the horror of being raped at the age of 14.
I'm not scared. I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor.
In America, Trump solves the climate change problem by appointing someone who doesn't believe in it. And Happy Christmas from Downing Street. What is in a card?
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. We know that politics is often all about division, exasperating sometimes, sure, but that is in the nature of the beast. However, the row between Boris Johnson and Theresa May today seemed to stray far beyond the normal political cut and thrust. It appears that the Prime Minister and her Foreign Secretary are at war in all but name and over a central pillar of Britain's global policy. The row began when it emerged that Mr Johnson had accused one of Britain's closest allies, Saudi Arabia, of conducting proxy wars in the Middle East. Number 10 then took the unusual step of insisting that the British Foreign Secretary was not speaking for Britain. Of course, many will argue Mr Johnson was only really saying what a lot of people think, but it does leave a pretty big question. Can he keep his job?
There were smiles and twinkling lights in Downing Street tonight, but Theresa May has, over the last 12 hours or so, shown a steely side to her nature as she publicly slapped down her Foreign Secretary. His remarks about a close ally were not government policy, Number 10 said sharply this morning. Those remarks were made a week ago at a conference in Italy when Boris Johnson said this about Britain's ally, Saudi Arabia.
You've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it.
All rather awkward, given Theresa May has just spent the last 3 days in the Gulf on a trade charm offensive, during which she met, dined with and gave a speech to the leader of, among others, Saudi Arabia.
The government has a voice. Number 10 in the Prime Minister's position is preeminent. But the importance is the closeness of the relationship with the Foreign Secretary.
And the preeminent voice would be Theresa May's, Number 10 decided. And her voice yesterday as she sat next to the Saudi king was clear. Iran, not Saudi Arabia, was the aggressor in this region.
I want to assure you that I am clear-eyed about the threat that Iran poses to the Gulf and the wider Middle East.
It's very difficult, isn't it, to have a Foreign Secretary who keeps saying things and then gets slapped down by the Prime Minister. How could any foreign country know what the British position is on anything?
Britain has a long association with Saudi Arabia. There have been many visits between our royal family and theirs dating back many decades. This is the Duke of Edinburgh in 1965. And this Prince Charles more recently. Of course, Saudi money buys a lot of British weaponry and jobs, and some of it is being used right now by Saudi Arabia in the war in the Yemen with Britain's support.
And the Saudis are not shy if they feel they're being criticised, if they feel they're losing face, in switching arms contracts. So at the very moment when we're trying to generate trade with that part of the world, whatever we think of their human rights position, we keep that to ourselves.
Boris Johnson has apparently told the Saudis his views before, and they haven't taken offence. Nevertheless, his Prime Minister did, and it became her turn to use some undiplomatic language in public.
And Chris is here with me now. Chris, these two haven't been in senior government together very long, have they? I mean, Honestly, how serious do you think this is?
I think this one is very serious, actually, Tom. Well, they've had some spats and some tiffs before, mostly over Brexit and some of the things he might have said that she didn't necessarily agree with. This one, I think, runs quite deep. A couple of reasons why I say that. I've just been with Theresa May in the Gulf region, and the speech she gave yesterday, sat next to the Saudi king, was very carefully calibrated not to cause offence. She flew back to Heathrow last night, got off the plane, and suddenly was hit with these words that her Foreign Secretary had issued. So when you speak to Downing Street this morning, normally they say, this isn't a slap down, it's OK. They weren't denying this morning that this was a quite severe reprimand for the Foreign Secretary. Meanwhile, over at the Foreign Office, they were really furious that Downing Street had gone so public and so severe in that reprimand. So the relationship really is quite strained tonight. I'll just add this, that the Foreign Office say that they've checked in with the British ambassador in Riyadh, and because the Foreign Secretary has said very similar things directly to the Saudis before, that this morning they weren't massively surprised. They haven't, they say, taken too much offence.
OK, I mean, let's just say that Theresa May grows exasperated with her Foreign Secretary and wants to sack him. I mean, could she, obviously she can, but in real political terms, he was part of the sort of post-Brexit settlement. She's a Remainer. He was the leader of the... I mean, what do you...
Well, you're right to say he was her Brexit cover. She was the Prime Minister when a lot of the Tory party was saying we can't have a Prime Minister who voted Remain. Boris Johnson was not only her Brexit cover, but the way in which he was able to fire Michael Gove. But I think when she appointed him as Foreign Secretary, many people wondered how long will it be until Boris Johnson puts his foot in that hole that most diplomats with experience step over or studiously step around. And it looks like he's done something like that tonight. And apparently, I'm told the Foreign Office have said to him, the diplomats, the mandarins in there have said to him many times, you can't say this now, Boris, you're the Foreign Secretary. His reply is always, I need to be authentic, I need to be myself, even in this very diplomatic role.
Authentic, Boris. It could get interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Chris, for now. You don't hear from Britain's top spy master very often. I guess you could say that's part of the job spec. So when he decides to talk publicly about the threats facing this country, well, you sort of have to sit up and pay attention. But Vladimir Putin will have been listening too, because much of today's blistering intervention by the head of MI6 was pointed straight at him. Russia's bombs, Alex Younger said, are fueling terrorism with the chaos they are causing in Syria, paving the way for more attacks in the UK by the so-called Islamic State. And you couldn't mistake the anger when he spoke about Aleppo, where he said Russia and the Assad regime want to make a desert and call it peace.
Russia is reclaiming the obliterated streets of Aleppo. Today, their soldiers were recovering improvised explosives. Russia excels at mine clearance. At ceasefires, it is proving far less enthusiastic. From MI6, an organisation that exists in the shadows, this was a surprisingly blunt assessment of Russia's actions. It came from the man known as C, real name Alex Younger.
In defining as a terrorist anyone who opposes a brutal regime, they alienate precisely that group that has to be on side if the extremists are to be defeated. Meanwhile, in Aleppo, Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking.
His speech was about consequence as well as cause. He said Britain won't be safe until the Syrian civil war is over.
I cannot say with any certainty what the next year will bring. But what I do know is this. We cannot be safe from the threats that emanate from that land unless the civil war is brought to an end. As I speak, the highly organised external attack planning structures within Daesh, even as they face military threat, are plotting ways to project violence against the UK and our allies without ever having to leave Syria.
And yet Russia, not IS, was the target of Britain's top spy.
I think it reflects a general irritation that you find across government towards Russia as a partner that they find very difficult to deal with, both at a sort of diplomatic level but also at a sort of political level.
It would be strange for a change in the British narrative about a war zone to be led from here. But that's exactly what seemed to happen today. And tonight the Russian embassy here in London hit back, saying people are tired of anti-Russian propaganda. That Russia is not only damaging regional security in the Middle East, but the national security of the UK too. Rohit Katru, News at 10 at MI6.
Well, in eastern Aleppo today, a trickle of wounded and traumatised residents managed to escape to relative safety. But thousands of men, women and children remain trapped, desperately in need of aid, desperate to escape the bombing and the shelling. Tonight, a diplomatic breakthrough seems to have offered them some hope. Russia says the Syrian army has stopped active military operations in eastern Aleppo to allow a major effort to remove civilians to safety.
These residents in eastern Aleppo know what's coming. The old, the young, those who for years had fought against President Assad get out before Syrian government troops and their allies arrive. Those few who have clung on are now streaming out of this shattered city. Even those unable to walk are being carried out. This man races to clutch the mother he has not seen for 5 years. They've been separated between government-held Western Aleppo and destroyed eastern districts, which are falling one after one to President Assad. He shows his mother the children born after the bombs started falling, grandchildren she has never seen. A brief, tiny moment of joy in a city so full of horror. Assad's forces have continued to tighten the noose around the remaining pockets of rebel resistance. But this evening, Russia said the Syrian military operations it's been helping through airstrikes have stopped as a large evacuation of 8,000 civilians was now underway. Speaking after talks with US Secretary of State John Kerry, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said there'd been a breakthrough to try to help civilians leave eastern Aleppo safely.
An agreement has been reached on a document that would determine ways and means of reaching the final solution of the eastern Aleppo problem by ensuring the withdrawal of all militants as well as civilians who would want to leave.
President Assad has said he believes retaking Aleppo will be a huge step towards defeating all his opponents throughout Syria. However wishful that prediction is, it feels very much that we're now witnessing the city being transferred to his rule at an unimaginable cost in lives and destruction. Raghi Omar, News at 10.
And top Russian and American military officials are due to meet in Geneva on Saturday for more talks about the situation in Aleppo. Back here, the President of the Supreme Court today tried to reassure those who don't like the courts intervening in the Brexit process. At the end of 4 days of deliberations, he said it's not a matter of overturning the referendum result, but asking how it will be brought into effect. Whether that satisfies the critics may well, of course, depend on the verdict the Supreme Court eventually delivers.
They arrived for the final day of this unprecedented legal case. The woman who brought it and won, and the man who's led the government's appeal. Leading legal figures pitted against each other to argue who has the power to start the process of leaving the EU, Parliament or the government.
It bears repeating that we are not being asked to overturn the result of the EU referendum. The ultimate question in this case concerns the process by which that result can lawfully be brought into effect. As we have heard, that question raises important constitutional issues.
This has been a case like no other, and it's the first time ever that all 11 justices have sat together to hear one. Now the country's top legal minds will make an historic ruling that will have huge political implications.
And despite being emotionally drained by the case, Gina Miller says those implications are just too important.
If the government is allowed to use this royal prerogative to take away people's rights on the domestic plane, then we set a very, very dangerous precedent. So this case is fundamentally about ensuring the checks and balances on governments.
But the government's position throughout has never wavered. It says it doesn't need Parliament's approval.
In the end, what we've been saying is that there are powers in the hands of the government to do this. We've heard a lot about the royal prerogative, which sounds like a very outdated concept. In truth, this is something that is a crucial part of the modern constitution. And we need those powers to do the job that government is given to do.
So all 11 judges will now decide whether it's the government who can trigger Article 50 alone or whether a parliamentary vote is needed. They will privately deliberate and must reach a majority verdict. That's expected in January. If they lose, the government will need to rush a bill through Parliament in order to keep to their Brexit timetable.
I think the pressures are in a way self-evident given the constitutional significance of this case. They're effectively being asked to referee between the government and Parliament. And so this will really be a very important case, delimiting the respective powers of the courts, the government and Parliament.
It's a case that's divided opinion across the country and, crucially, one that could derail the Prime Minister's plan to get on with Brexit alone and avoid scrutiny from Parliament. Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Westminster.
It may seem a long way from the rarefied legal arena of the Supreme Court to the streets and communities where Britons lead their daily lives. Yet, as all sides of the argument have been at pains to point out repeatedly, leaving the EU is an issue that affects everyone profoundly. Tonight, our political editor, Robert Peston, brings you the second part of his Brexit road trip. He's travelled from Huddersfield to Liverpool to find out what people think of the big changes coming their way.
How are you? Very well indeed. Where are we more than 5 months after we voted to leave the European Union? Steve, owner of a chauffeuring business in West Yorkshire, knows his way around these parts all right, but he'd like more of a Brexit map.
You personally would like to see a bit more detail of what Theresa May thinks she can achieve.
What her aims will be and what we'll end up with is probably something completely different. Well, bearing in mind we're now 6 months on from the vote.
Yeah.
And really, nobody's said what at least their aim is.
Down on the farm, well, the high-tech dairy, really. They're also anxious, but they can't see where we're going. Who voted to leave?
When I voted, I thought it'd be quite a quick fix. I don't know why I was so naive to think it was a quick fix.
Have things got any worse for you yet?
No. Well, apart from £100 more on my car insurance.
Right.
And the guy on the phone said that was because of Brexit.
Really?
Yeah. He said...
You sure he wasn't putting a fast one there? Is there anybody feeling that things might get better?
I feel optimistic in the sense that, come what may, will come through, really.
So we're not going to hell in a handcart, but what is the destination? Well, mine is fab Liverpool. How do you feel now?
Devastated, really. The shock is still there.
In terms of what you've seen so far of the new Prime Minister, do you have confidence in her?
Yeah, certainly. What we've seen so far,
In my opinion, the EU's quite corrupt, so I think we pay a lot of money into the EU, and we don't really know where necessarily it's going.
Choose a word about how you now feel about leaving the EU.
About leaving, optimistic, but about the way people have been made to feel, sad, very sad.
So now I'm in Liverpool's Bold Street. I wonder why I chose to go there. How do you feel about it?
I'm happy the way things have gone because they say the economy's growing. And I don't feel full of doom and gloom.
I just wish they'd hurry up and get on with it, really. And it annoys me that people want to try and change the vote.
I'm worried about everything going up. I mean, we haven't left yet, so, we've got all this to come.
How do you feel about where we are now?
Confused. I think I was confused before. I don't think enough information came out before the elections, and now we've actually voted to leave Europe. I'm even more confused. I think I'm very similar to everybody else.
The sun setting on an era when we drew strength from our marriage to other European nations. Being single again is exciting and scary. Whenever I look out across the Mersey, I'm filled with excitement by the opportunities of getting out into the big wide world. But there are also uncertainties. Now, if I've learned something in my short trip from East Coast to West Coast, it's that there's no turning back from Brexit, but there are also huge uncertainties about what it'll mean for us. Robert Peston, News at 10 in Liverpool.
Now, back in London, the voice of one MP in a speech that was as brave as it was remarkable stilled the House of Commons into silence today. The words of Michelle Thomson, a Scottish independent MP, visibly moved her colleagues as she told how she was raped at the age of 14. The Speaker, John Bercow, was among many reduced to tears. After describing her ordeal during a debate on violence against women, Ms Thomson said, "I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor." It was certainly a moment of parliamentary history unlikely to be forgotten.
A place where MPs normally struggle to be heard. But today the House of Commons listened in silence to a shocking but brave speech.
When I was 14, I was raped. As is common, it was by somebody who was known to me. He had offered to walk me home from a youth event, and I remember, first of all, feeling surprise, then fear, then horror, as I realised I quite simply couldn't escape.
With many colleagues in tears, she explained why she didn't tell anyone for years.
Afterwards, I walked home alone. I was crying, I was cold and I was shivering, and I now realise, of course, that was the shock response. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police. I bottled it all up inside me.
Surely one of the most personal, emotional speeches ever heard in the Commons.
I'm not scared, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor.
The Speaker, clearly moved, thanked her.
What she has said and the way in which she said it, which has left an indelible impression upon us all.
Such a personal and yet powerful speech is being heard far beyond a hushed House of Commons. Michelle Thomson's words are sparking a much wider debate about sexual violence. One of Parliament's newest MPs, Tracy Brabin, who replaced the murdered Jo Cox, also spoke of her own experiences in today's debate.
This can happen to you. 1 in 4 women have experienced some sort of violence, and obviously children as well. And I think that is a direct call to action.
The bravery of an MP clearly aimed at helping so many others to break taboos, to put pressure on the government, to bring in new legal rights for victims of sexual violence, who so often stay silent, never to be heard. Angus Walker, News at 10, Westminster.
And you can watch the whole of Michelle Thomson's speech in the Commons on our website. That's at itv.com/news. In America, another Donald Trump cabinet appointment today, and you won't be entirely surprised to learn another controversy. The president-elect's choice as head of the Environmental Protection Agency is already well known, one might almost say notorious, as a climate change skeptic. The appointment of Scott Pruitt accords with the signals Mr. Trump was giving on the issue during his campaign, but some fear it could also mean the undoing of President Obama's climate change achievements.
Scott Pruitt claims Americans are tired of seeing billions in dollars drained from their economy because of unnecessary environmental regulations. As for global warming, he reckons that debate is far from settled, prompting critics to describe him as a climate change denier and his appointment as tantamount to putting an arsonist in charge of forest fires. Incredible as it sounds, Scott Pruitt will head the very institution he sued as an ally of the fossil fuel industry over its efforts to reduce emissions. But then this is his new boss.
A lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
Yet there's a growing international acceptance that global warming is anything but.
Pour le climat est accepté.
A consensus surrounding the science of climate change cemented in Paris last year, when almost 200 countries committed to an agreement reducing emissions. Donald Trump's threatened to pull out.
We're the only country in the world that has an elected leader who doesn't accept the science of climate change, and appointing a climate denier, one of the chief climate deniers in the United States, to lead our Environmental Protection Agency is wrong.
But come to coal mining communities in West Virginia, and the niceties of Paris seem a world away. Towns rich in coal, but now torn apart by poverty, where they've lost faith in everything except for their new president.
He's for coal. Ain't nobody else for us. I mean, it's all we got.
Pruitt's appointment claims the president-elect will cut regulations and create jobs for responsible energy providers.
Donald Trump wants to reverse President Obama's shift towards wind and solar power and build more coal-fired plants like this one. But while his politics may be driven by the gut, the economics may prove rather more complicated. Because even if he gets rid of clean energy incentives and subsidises new coal plants, investors want certainty, and in a changing world, 4 years isn't much.
Yeah, put it on, right?
But for those who care about science and the health of our planet, it may feel like an eternity. Rachel Younger, News at 10, Virginia.
Also in America, one of the legendary pioneers of space exploration, the former astronaut John Glenn, has died at the age of 95.
Speed, John Glenn.
Mr. Glenn was a military test pilot before joining NASA, where he became the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. He received a hero's welcome on returning to Earth and then entered politics, serving as a US Senator for 25 years. But in 1998, 36 years after orbiting Earth, he became the oldest person ever to go into space, flying on the space shuttle at the age of 77. John Glenn, who died today, he was 95. And finally, Christmas cards are an important yearly ritual, of course, for many people, a way of staying in touch as the years rush by. For number 10, of course, the Prime Minister's Christmas card has added diplomatic importance. Sometimes Mrs May can appear, outwardly at least, shall we say, a little stern. So it's revealing, perhaps, that her choice of Christmas card design indicates something of a softer side to her character. It's Christmas time, and that moment when, as a new Prime Minister, you have to send out cards in the knowledge that they're going to be pored over for what they say about you. Well, these are Theresa May's choices this year, all drawn by children. Festive, charming, and above all, safe.
I think it's really, really telling that Theresa May has actually gone quite old school. She's gone for the classic local children in a local school, having done a nice picture of Downing Street. It's not too flamboyant, it's not too showy. It's quite sort of Theresa May.
You think you can't go wrong? Well, remember this? Call it a hit from the Super Tan years. And if you think that didn't quite hit the spot, how about this one from a politician in Puerto Rico, complete with animals mauling each other? Or this from the US ambassador to Finland. Yep, that is him in a sauna. So if the Prime Minister played it safe, what should she have done? We asked leading cartoonist Richard Jolly.
If I was drawing her Christmas card, I think, as I say, because her big achievement this year is to become Prime Minister rather than anything else, I'd want to draw her in Downing Street, a nice Downing Street scene, but then you'd want to put a bit more of a Nightmare Before Christmas kind of twist on it, because that is how she's got to where she is this year. So I'd be thinking Theresa May as a snow woman, but then it all looking a little bit more scary when you get actually close to it, because that's what politics is like. I think all the other Bullingdon boys, headless at her feet, and maybe Boris the snowman cowering a bit, Theresa the snow woman, conquering all her foes. There we are. Happy Christmas, Prime Minister.
So there you have it. Happy Christmas. Not quite there yet. Before we go tonight, though, let's just have a quick look at what's likely to be making the news tomorrow. Voting closed in the Sleaford by-election about half an hour ago. So we'll be reading the runes on the result, whether there's a noticeable Brexit effect, for instance, such as in the recent Richmond by-election, where the Lib Dems fought a successful campaign on the issue. Football's world governing body, FIFA, is to decide on any punishment over Poppygate, the wearing of Poppy Day emblems at recent internationals involving England, Scotland and Wales. FIFA insists that the wearing of items with a political message is against its rules, even with something as traditional as poppies. And the consequences of the first report into doping in Russian sport were massive enough, with hundreds of Russian athletes banned from the Rio Olympics. The second part of the McLaren report is published tomorrow. The world of athletics will be holding its breath. I think it's fair to say it could be just as seismic. Julie will be here for that tomorrow. I will be back next week, on Monday, in fact. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and good night.